we're going to talk about frontal lobes. The front part of your brain, which extends back to about just above your ears. So it's quite a large portion of our brain tissue. Can anyone tell me what happens in the frontal lobes?
Personality.
Personality? Behaviour? Intelligence? Mood? Yeah. All right. That's a good start. Let's have a look at some of the things we know about the frontal lobes. The front part of our brain historically has been an area that was, there was a lot of knowledge came from accidents that people would have to the front part of their brain. And in addition to accidents, there were often medical procedures to the front part of the brain, and this is one of them. This is what's called a frontal leucotomy. Now, the frontal leucotomy was to, if you imagine this is something going into, or that side of the brain. So they would drill a hole into the skull, and the front part of the brain would have this little thing put into it, and would then have, they would pull something back here and it would rotate a small blade that would sever the brain tissue in an arc round in a circle. So it's what's called if you like, a lobotomy. Yeah, but they called it a frontal leucotomy. Essentially, it meant that the brain tissue from the front part was severed in some way, so that a lot of the connections in there controlling personality and mood were damaged, and behaviour were damaged deliberately, as a way of controlling out of control behaviour, for instance.
Did it work?
No.
Anybody survive?
Yeah, they all survived, and often this operation in a changed form. Sometimes there was a chap who promoted this this operation. He would actually use a little ice pick, and he would go up through your eye, and he would do it in his surgery. Stick it in there, wiggle it around, and take it out.
Well, the person
They used to
probably
call
serving
him-
it, I'm thinking.
His name was Freeman, so they used to call him Ice Pick Freeman. But you will find him in the historical records as somebody who did a lot of it and used it a bit inappropriately, we would regard today. But it was regarded as the way to modify people's behaviour. And unfortunately, it often resulted in people's personalities becoming drastically changed in not good directions, and their mood and their outlook on life and their motivation were all damaged as a result.
Isn't this some operation they do now with epilepsy?
Yes, very similar sort of operation, but as you might imagine, it's much more targeted. And that's, so these sort of operations still occur, but they're done in a much more intelligent and respectful and humane manner with a particular purpose in mind. So brain surgery still happens, but a lot better than it used to.
We've had a lady when she's in our facility at the moment that's had deep brain stimulation.
Oh, yeah.
Through her functions.
Right. With good effect?
Yeah, so. Not brilliant, but...
It varies from person to person, but some people get great relief.
Yeah.
So you can see here the connections to and from the frontal area of the brain. There's a lot of activity that involves the front part of the brain. These are what's called the associative pathways that connect the front part of the brain. If we just follow one, there's one, connects there, comes down there, there. There's another one, goes all the way through down to there. So there's a number of connections here in activity that involves the front part of the brain either coming or going, information into the front part of the brain or information from the front part of the brain to the rest of the brain. And here we can see the two areas for language that I referred to earlier. Broca's area is in the front for speech production, I believe, and speech comprehension is Wernicke's area. Wernicke's and Broca's area, two very interesting and important areas for us. And one of them is in the frontal lobes and the others in the temporal lobes. And you can see there the motor cortex, the strip, and the sensory cortex there is the strip behind the motor cortex.
Broca's area for
Speech production.
and Wernicke's area for what did you say?
Comprehension.
Comprehension.
Yeah. Think of it as giving out and receiving.
It's interesting that there is such different.
Yeah, fascinating. But two very distinct areas, yeah, are quite separate. And so if there's a stroke here, often the connectedness between the two can often be severed, so that what they hear is not not related to what will be produced, which is exactly what Linda was describing earlier. And there's a term that you'll sometimes come across in the literature called the frontal syndrome, or frontal lobe syndrome. And sometimes if you have a person from a psychiatric team come out and do an assessment, they may well describe a frontal syndrome. Now, frontal syndrome is a collection of behaviour that looks like this. There are personality changes that are quite distinct. Diminished anxiety and concern for the future. In other words, the person seems a bit blasé about what's happening, unconcerned. Impulsive. So they will be likely to think something and do it without concern for the consequences. But they will be able to tell you quite persuasively, no, that's fine, I won't go out, I won't go into that person's room again. I understand exactly the need for me to stay out of that room, that's fine. You turn your back, you go back to the office and they're in the room the next thing. Now, the impulsiveness is what causes that to happen. But associated with it is also an unawareness of their social behaviour and an inability to stop themselves. So they get the impulse and they simply can't stop themselves acting. So there's no brakes. You and I can put the brakes on ourselves and say, no, don't do that. Don't say that. And so we don't. We can inhibit our behaviour. But the person with dementia and or somebody with a frontal syndrome will not have the ability to put the brakes on or to censor their behaviour. So the frontal lobes are what you might call your social censor.
It may be like wandering, like intrusive to the other residents.
Yeah, that's right. So somebody who is repeatedly doing things, who says, no, I won't do that again.
Because you will check back to the room and they will be walking behind you again.
Yeah.
So,
And that could be a memory problem, or it could be a frontal lobe problem. Lack of initiative and spontaneity. So the person tends to have what they call amotivation. Amotivation simply means they just sit there.
I do impulsive.
What's that?
I do impulsive.
Yeah, well, alternatively, yes. So you tend to have one or the other. And often, they'll be the person who won't come and involve themselves in anything, or they won't come to lunch unless you take them, unless you invite them. So they'll come in response to something, but you might have to explicitly say, come on, stand up now and come to lunch. Okay, what you're doing is you're providing the starter motor for their brain, because their brain lacks the starter motor to trigger the behavioural response. Of the initiative. Disinhibition is closely associated with this impulsiveness. It's no inhibition, no brakes, no stop sense. It's not okay to say this. Don't say it. It's that internal censor that stops us saying things to other people. And yet you'll sometimes hear, and I'm sure you do hear things that people with dementia will say, sometimes about staff, and they'll commentate or they'll critique you in the most embarrassing way because they don't have any inhibition.
I really have to share a really nice quote. This lady, I had to give tablets, and she was sitting in a chair, and she's quite the queen bee, you know, like, you take that, just a bit like that. And I was standing there giving her medication, and she said to me, "Are you pregnant?" No, I'm not actually. And she looked up and said, "No, you're way too old for that."
Oh, dear.
Exactly what they're doing there.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, the sorts of things, yes.
Still.
There's one lady at our work, she's always, we just want to mention physio, and he's one of, there are probably three men who regularly work, and the physio is there every day, and every time he walks by, she just throws, like, she's like, "Oh, hello, who's that handsome guy?" Like, every man she sees, she hits on them, and it's really good.
That's a good example of disinhibition. Both a good example.
Yeah, I used to, not everyone, and not strangers, but people in the home that she just go up to them and more just be affectionate.
Yeah.
In a different way. She was always affectionate beforehand, but in a different way than you before.
Right. Yeah. So there's that's a very good example of disinhibition. Yeah. And unaware that that might not be okay.
Yeah.
Or that it was different to how I might have usually functioned.
Yeah.
In younger onset dementia, sometimes the frontal impairment can sometimes take the form of sexual disinhibition. So they can be sexually inappropriate with younger people, not realising that in fact that's not okay. It can look like quite perverted behaviour, but in fact it is due to frontal syndrome, simply because they don't have any brakes, any off switch as it were, and any social sensor to say this is not appropriate.
Can you give me another English word for disinhibition?
Uncontrolled. It's not quite that. It's inhibited is
Rather than guidelines and guidelines, when you're disinhibited, there's no boundaries in this.
When you're inhibited,
Yeah.
you're drawn, aren't you?
lacking boundaries.
Yeah.
But sometimes you find, like, sometimes they've got something that they want to say which is really truthful, but in a normal circumstance, like for me, I cannot say that.
Strip off the clothes in the day room because they don't know that they're not
That's right.
supposed to be
I've got
doing
an
that.
example of this
Then
lady.
they don't understand that you can't strip off your clothes in public.
That's disrobing is often because of the impulsiveness, but also the disinhibition, a lack of awareness that that's not okay in the public areas. Do it in your room, no problem, but not in the public areas. Yeah.
I was just going to say, like, in our facility, we've got this other lady, she's got dementia, but she really knows, like, what's happening around here. She doesn't have the boundaries. So one of these days, I entered a new resident. Then the relative came and she was complaining about something. I stood up, I attended to it. I came back, I sat down and started to write. In about 15 minutes, she came back again. It was something else different. And this lady is just watching. Then she came the third time, and that took me really a lot of time to go and solve what she wanted. Then when she came for the fourth day, she said, "Oh gosh, do you think you're the only person in this place?" Then when this lady said, "Oh, sorry darling, what did you say?" I said, "No, I'm not talking to you, I'm just talking to my neighbor seated right here."
Very socially inappropriate.
Yeah, I was embarrassed in a way, but she was telling the truth. Like,
Yeah. But she doesn't hold back.
yeah.
That's right. It's a good example of disinhibition. So the frontal syndrome is a very important one, and you'll come across it sometimes in people who have had some strokes, particularly right frontal strokes. If you hear or see in the medical record there was a right frontal infarction, then you might think about this type of disinhibition, but the verbal skills might be quite intact. So
What
that
about aggressiveness? precepts of them.
Yeah, you'll find that the disinhibition also affects the ability to stop the anger building into aggression.
We had a gentleman, this was years ago, he was actually a race jockey, jump jockey, and he had a bad accident, I think 1957 or something like that, and he actually had frontal lobe damage.
Oh, okay.
And he could actually, he'd get out of innocence for no reason, be very aggressive.
Yeah. That's thank you, that's a good example. Behaviour for no obvious reason can often be a good example of frontal syndrome. In other words, there's no particular stimulus in the environment, but the person acts because of the inner stimulus. Does that make sense?
He'd just get very angry for
Yeah.
no reason, just outbursts.
It's a surge of emotion, and because the frontal lobes don't control it, you get the amygdala surging, and it's uncontrolled and amygdala surge. The intellectual changes that happen in a frontal syndrome, in addition to the personality changes, impairment of recent memory, so not able to remember as well, and a loss of abstract thinking. Abstract thinking is your more higher order thinking. Think about abstract things are things you can't see or hear. So we can think about safety. Safety is an abstract notion or idea. But a person with frontal impairment will be very concrete in their thinking. So quite often what they will do to test frontal impairment is they will give them a proverb. And you'll ask the person, say, a stitch in time saves 9. What does that mean? So what I'd be looking for is some explanation for the meaning that you need to do things now so that you're prepared and you don't have to do a bigger job later on. So if you take action now, it'll save you the effort of something bigger later on. That's what a stitch in time saves 9 means. But the person with frontal impairment may well say something like, well, you'll have to do it 9 times. If you're sewing, you have to do things 9 times to make sure you get it right. So what they do is they're very literal in their interpretation, very concrete, rather than abstract, which is thinking about the ideas. Does that make sense? Leadership is an abstract idea. Does that make sense? It's not specific. You can't have a kilogram of leadership. Kilogram of safety. Inability to shift perspective. Now, this is often what causes a lot of difficulty for staff. It's what's called difficulty changing set. You get a set. The person with frontal impairment will have difficulty moving off their particular frame of reference. So if they have a perspective, they will find it very difficult to change. It'll look like stubbornness or deliberate willful disobedience, but it's often not. It's more likely to be difficulty in shifting their perspective, because what you might be wanting them to do is to appreciate how it feels for other people. But they won't be able to do that because that involves them shifting their perspective and taking the perspective of somebody else. That's called empathy. These people are not going to have empathy or find it very difficult to empathise with the experience of another person, largely because of this inability to shift perspective. Difficulty changing set. The next one is inability to plan and follow a course of action. They generally won't be able to follow through much, and the impulsiveness tends to cut them off and make them start some things and then they'll move on to something else and then they'll go on to something else. So they flip like butterflies from one flower to another. No concentration, no ability to follow something through. So you'll find them half-dressed in the public area because they started getting dressed and then they had an idea about something and they go off. Difficulty to grasp a whole, to break it up and synthesise it, to put it together. So getting dressed is a whole activity. But to be able to get dressed, you need to be able to see the parts, to identify the individual pieces of clothing, and to put them on in the right order, so that you don't end up with your undies over the top. So we need to grasp the whole situation. In other words, what I'm working towards is being dressed. I want to break it up so that I put my undies on first, and then I put my trousers, then I put my shirt, then I put my socks, my shoes, etc. Right? In whatever order ends up with me being totally appropriately dressed. So I synthesize it, put it all together, and work towards that goal. That's what you and I do. But the person with frontal impairment won't be able to do that. They'll come out with some step wrong, or they won't be able to see the whole process through. And in Alzheimer's dementia, for instance, you will find that there are aspects of this as well. So the person will display very similar symptoms. Other changes are what's called adynamia. If a person is adynamic, it means they lack motivation. They don't have a motivation for action, so they lack the starter motor that I spoke about earlier, amotivated. Confabulation refers to the fabrication of answers. They make things up. So they will have fantastic stories about what they did yesterday, whereas in fact they might have been sitting there like this all day. But they'll have a fantastic story about what they actually did. And sometimes you'll find with alcohol abuse and the impairment that comes from chronic alcohol abuse, that people with Korsakoff syndrome, which is the memory loss associated with alcohol abuse, they will also confabulate a lot. They'll make stories up. And poor judgment and insight, particularly around what's appropriate or like in public, so there'll be sexual behaviour in public, or there might be unsafe behaviour, physical, in public. And lack of insight about the effects of their behaviour on other people. They will also find that that's, or you will find that that's a real problem, because they'll upset people and without being really concerned about the effect. And it can look a lot like psychopathic behaviour. It can look a lot, it can seem like, oh gosh, this person's really hard and tough. So they also finally have poor utilisation behaviour. In other words, they have trouble using things appropriately, and poor attention concentration, which will go to all the other things to help to make them worse, because they can't stick at anything. They tend to flit and change quickly. In the frontal lobes, because Broca's area is in the frontal lobes, there will also be language problems. And this is where we're going to deal now with the aphasias. The language problems in the frontal lobes, they often appear intact at first, especially with vascular disease, where the strokes have been in the frontal area. But because Broca's expressive aphasia affects that area, there'll be a loss of vocabulary, so they'll lose particular words, and a loss of complexity. It'll be much more like a telegram or an SMS almost. You get very stilted language. And so one of the tests that we do sometimes if we're going to test for language impairment is I'll ask somebody, can you repeat this sentence after me? No ifs, ands or buts. So what that is it's all the joining words. But I've put them all together in a sentence. But to the person with frontal impairment and an aphasia associated with the frontal lobe, they won't be able to say it. They simply can't say that.
That's in the mini mental assessments we all have to do.
It is, yeah. That's right. Yeah, I haven't had to use that for a while. The man went outside. Yeah, and outside is an abstract idea. The tall man ran outside quickly. Yeah, just examples with adjectives that they are not able to repeat.